Walter Graystone was 61 years old, and everyone said his new wife, Celeste, loved him more than his money ever could. But one evening, his maid's 5-year-old daughter tugged his sleeve and asked a question that stopped him cold. "Mr. Walter, why does Auntie Celeste practice crying in the mirror right before you come home?" Walter laughed it off, until the little girl said one more thing, and his whole world went ice cold. Before we start, comment where you're watching from tonight, and tap that subscribe button, because this story is going to show you something a 5-year-old noticed that a whole house full of grown adults missed completely. Let me tell you about Walter Graystone. Walter was 61 years old, a quiet, careful man who'd built a shipping company from a single truck into an empire that touched 3 continents. 2 years back, he lost his wife Eleanor to a long illness, and for a while, that big house of his sat as silent and empty as a church on a Monday morning. His friends worried about him, his doctor worried about him. So when Walter came home one spring evening and introduced everyone to a warm, laughing woman named Celeste, 18 years younger than him, folks were relieved more than anything. She was kind at every charity dinner. She held his arm just right at every gala. She cried, soft and pretty, at the mention of Eleanor's memory, and told Walter she only wanted to help him feel whole again. 18 months later, they were married, and the house had laughter in it again. But there was one person in that house who never quite trusted the sound of it, and she was only 5 years old. Working in that house 5 days a week was a woman named Carla, a widow herself, raising her daughter Mia, alone on a maid's modest salary. Mia was small for her age, quiet, with the kind of watchful eyes that made grown-ups forget she was even in the room sometimes. She'd sit in the corner of the kitchen after school, coloring, listening to everything, the way children do when the adults around them assume they're not paying attention at all. And Mia had noticed something strange about Celeste almost from the very first week, something none of the other staff, none of Walter's friends, none of his own family had ever caught on to, because they were all too busy admiring how perfectly Celeste seemed to fit into that big, lonely house. It started small. Every time Walter came home from a business trip, Celeste would send Carla out on some errand, fresh flowers from a very particular shop across town, a specific brand of tea that was always out of stock at the nearest store, something that reliably took 20-30 minutes to complete. Carla thought nothing of it at first. Rich households had their little quirks, she figured, and Celeste was simply particular. But one afternoon, Carla was sent out on one of those errands with Mia in tow. The school bus had come early, and there was nowhere else for the girl to wait. Carla left Mia in the small den just off the kitchen with her coloring books, told her to stay put, and hurried out the side door to fetch whatever Celeste had asked for that day. Mia, being 5, did not stay put. She wandered, quiet as a cat, down the hallway toward the sound of Celeste's voice coming from her dressing room, a room Mia had never been allowed inside, not that anyone had ever needed to tell her not to go there. The door was open just a crack, and what Mia saw through that little gap was something her small mind didn't have words for yet, though her memory held onto every second of it perfectly. Celeste was standing at her mirror, alone, practicing, her face crumpled slowly, tears rising right on cue, her voice breaking into a soft, trembling whisper. "Oh, Walter, I just love you so much, I don't know what I'd do." And then, just as smoothly, her face would reset, blank and calm, before she did it all over again from the start, like an actress running her lines before curtain. Mia didn't understand what rehearsing tears meant. She only knew it looked wrong, the same unsettled feeling she got watching a puppet show where the puppet's smile never quite reached its painted eyes. She backed away from that door, slow and careful, the way you back away from something without quite knowing why you're scared of it, and slipped back into the den just as her mother returned with the flowers. Carla noticed nothing different about her daughter that afternoon. Mia didn't say a word about it, not that day, not the next, not for almost 2 full weeks. She just carried it quietly inside her, the way children carry the strange things they see, filed away until the right moment finally comes along to let it out. That right moment arrived on a Thursday evening, when Walter came home early, from a trip nobody expected him back from, until Friday. He walked into the kitchen still in his travel coat, tired but smiling, and there was little Mia sitting at the counter with a cup of milk, swinging her feet off the tall stool, waiting for her mother to finish up for the day. Walter, who'd grown fond of the quiet little girl over these many months, leaned down with a warm smile and asked her the same simple question he always asked. "And how was your day, Miss Mia?" Mia looked up at him with those calm, watchful eyes of hers, considered the question seriously the way she considered everything, and then asked him something so strange, so specific, that Walter's tired smile froze right on his face. "Mr. Walter, why does Auntie Celeste practice crying in the mirror right before you come home?" Walter let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh a tired man gives when he's not quite sure he heard a child correctly. "Practice crying? Mia, sweetheart, that's a funny thing to say. Where would you get an idea like that?" He was already reaching for the coffee pot, already halfway back to thinking about the meeting waiting for him tomorrow, treating the whole thing like the kind of odd little thing children say when they've mixed up a dream with real life. Mia just kept swinging her feet on that tall stool, unbothered by his laughter, the way children are when they know exactly what they saw and don't need a grown-up to believe them right away. "I saw her," Mia said simply, like she was reporting the weather. "Through the door. She does it a lot." Walter set the coffee pot down slower than he meant to, something about the flat, matter-of-fact way Mia said it. No exaggeration, no drama, just a plain little fact reported by a plain little girl, made the laugh die in his throat before it fully left him. "A lot," he repeated. Mia nodded, taking a sip of her milk, entirely unaware of the weight her small words were suddenly carrying in that kitchen. And then, because 5-year-olds rarely know when to stop at the most important part of a story, she added one more detail, tossed off just as casually as the first. "And one time, she was on the phone, and she said, 'Not yet,' real quiet. Then she looked happy, like when I win at checkers." Walter stood completely still by that counter, coffee pot forgotten in his hand, staring at this small girl who had just, without any idea what she was doing, cracked open something he hadn't let himself look at directly in 18 months of marriage. That night, Walter lay awake beside Celeste, long after her breathing had gone slow and even, staring up at the dark ceiling, turning over every gentle, tearful moment of their courtship, like pages in a book he was suddenly reading for the first time. He thought about how her tears always seemed to arrive exactly when guests were watching. He thought about how she'd cried, soft and perfect, at their engagement dinner in front of his oldest business partners, but never once when they were alone in the quiet of their own bedroom. He thought about how flawless she always looked, even in grief. Not one hair out of place, not one moment of the ugly, messy sorrow real grief usually brings. A man doesn't want to notice these things about his own wife. But once a 5-year-old hands you the thread, it's very hard to stop pulling on it. The next few days, Walter watched more carefully than he had in a long, long time. Not with suspicion exactly, he told himself, just with the quiet attention of a man who'd built his fortune by noticing small details other people missed. And he began to notice something else, something closer to home than tears in a mirror. Celeste's brother Julian, a smooth, well-dressed estate attorney who'd been helping with the family finances for the better part of a year, had been gently, persistently pushing Walter toward a few small paperwork changes. Nothing alarming on its own. Updating the will, naming Celeste medical power of attorney. Just sensible precautions, Walter. Given your heart condition, given your age, you understand. Julian always said it with a reassuring smile, the kind of smile that made you feel foolish for even hesitating. "I want to pause right here and ask you something, friend, Bagdo, because I think a lot of you watching tonight already know the answer in your gut. Have you ever had that same quiet feeling, that something in your own home wasn't quite what it seemed, long before you had any proof of it at all? If you have, comment "Never judge" below, because Walter's next move wasn't born out of anger. It was born out of that same quiet gut feeling every one of us has felt at least once in our lives, the one we usually talk ourselves out of trusting. Walter didn't confront anyone, not yet. He was too careful a businessman for that, and too wounded a man to risk being wrong about the one thing that had made his big empty house feel warm again. Instead, late one evening, while Celeste was out at what she called her book club, Walter sat down quietly in his study, with the household phone records spread across his desk. Old habit from decades of reading contracts. Nobody else bothered to read closely. Most of the numbers meant nothing to him. Grocery deliveries, the hair salon, Celeste's sister in Ohio. But one number kept appearing, over and over, every single week for the last 4 months, always on a Tuesday, always right around the same time each time. A number he didn't recognize at all, with no name attached to it in any of his contacts. And as Walter sat there staring at that unfamiliar number circled in his own careful handwriting, he had no idea yet that he was looking at the exact date, every single week, of his own doctor's appointments. Walter sat with that circled number for 3 days before he finally decided what to do about it. He wasn't a man who acted on feelings alone. 61 years in business had taught him that feelings without proof were just expensive mistakes waiting to happen. So instead of confronting Celeste, instead of asking Julian a single question, Walter quietly picked up the phone and called an old friend from his early shipping days, a man who'd gone on to run a small private investigation firm after retiring from the police force. "I need you to look into something for me," Walter told him, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "Quietly, and I need you to start with a phone number." He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. His friend had heard that particular tone in Walter's voice only once before, years ago, right before a shipping partner turned out to be running stolen cargo through Walter's own ports. It took his friend less than a week to trace that number back to a name: Dr. Ashford, a psychiatric consultant who specialized in something Walter had never heard of before: competency evaluations, the kind of clinical assessments used in courtrooms to determine whether an aging person was fit to manage their own affairs. Walter read that word twice, sitting alone in his study with the lamp turned low. Competency. He thought of every small stumble he'd had lately, every moment of dizziness he'd chalked up to getting older, every time Celeste had gently, sweetly suggested he rest a little more, or let Julian handle the details. "Darling, you've got enough on your plate." Each one of those small kindnesses, laid end to end now, started to look less like love and a lot more like a case file being built one soft comment at a time. But Walter's friend wasn't finished. 2 days later, he came back with something heavier still. Court records showing that Celeste and Julian had already met, twice, with a clerk in the county courthouse regarding a preliminary guardianship filing. The paperwork, still in draft form, described Walter as increasingly confused, medically unstable, and unsafe to manage his affairs independently, supported by a growing file of notes, dates, and small documented incidents. Incidents Walter didn't remember experiencing quite the way they'd apparently been written down. Walter sat back in his chair, feeling something cold settle deep into his chest, because a woman preparing to convince a judge her husband couldn't think clearly needed evidence. And evidence, if it doesn't exist naturally, can always be quietly, carefully manufactured. That thought sent Walter down to his own medicine cabinet that same night, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the small orange bottle of heart medication he took every single morning without fail. He'd noticed himself feeling a little foggier lately, a little more unsteady on his feet some mornings, and had simply assumed it was age catching up with him, the way age eventually catches up with everyone. But now, staring at those familiar white pills under the bathroom light, a terrible new possibility took shape in his mind. The next morning, instead of taking his pill straight from the bottle in the bathroom, he had his old friend quietly collect a sample and send it to a lab for independent testing. The results came back 4 days later, and they confirmed the thing Walter had almost talked himself out of, believing was even possible. The medication in that bottle wasn't his prescribed dosage at all. It had been quietly, carefully diluted, mixed with a weaker filler, just enough to cause the mild confusion and unsteadiness Celeste had apparently been noting down for months as proof of his declining mind. Not enough to be dangerous to his heart. Just enough to make an otherwise sharp, capable man look exactly like the confused, fragile husband a judge would believe needed someone else to manage his affairs. Walter sat alone in his study that evening with those lab results in his hand, and for the first time since Eleanor passed, he felt something colder than grief settle into his chest. The particular cold of realizing the person sleeping beside you every night has been quietly rehearsing your ending. And that was when it hit him. The mirror. The whispered words Mia had described so plainly at that kitchen counter weeks ago. Celeste hadn't been crying out of love or fear at all. She'd been rehearsing, practicing the exact tearful, devastated performance she planned to give a judge, the concerned young wife, forced into an unimaginable decision about her poor, declining husband. A 5-year-old girl, sitting quietly with her milk and her crayons, had described a courtroom performance months before Walter ever knew there would be a courtroom at all. He thought of Mia's calm, steady little voice. She looked happy, like when I win at checkers, and understood now exactly what that happiness had been. Celebration. Because in Celeste's mind, she'd already won. Walter was still sitting with that thought. Lab results and court documents spread across his desk like the pieces of a puzzle he wished he'd never had to finish, when his phone rang softly on the desk beside him. Celeste's name lit up the screen, her voice coming through warm and sweet as ever, the moment he answered. "Walter, darling, don't forget. You've got your appointment with Dr. Ashford first thing tomorrow morning. I've already cleared my whole schedule to come with you." Walter closed his eyes, the same doctor's name from that phone record, staring back at him from the page in front of him, and realized with a sinking, certain feeling that tomorrow morning wasn't a doctor's appointment at all. It was the hearing, and he had exactly one night left to decide whether he was walking into that room as a confused old man everyone expected him to be, or as the sharpest businessman this city had ever seen. Walter didn't sleep that night, but for the first time in weeks, his mind felt sharper than it had in months. He flushed the tampered pills down the sink and replaced them, quietly, with a fresh bottle his old detective friend had picked up under a different pharmacist's watch. The correct dosage this time, verified and sealed. He called his personal attorney at midnight, a man who'd handled Walter's business affairs for 30 years and had never once steered him wrong, and laid out everything on the table. The mirror, the phone records, the guardianship filing, the lab results. His attorney listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do when they sense a storm is about to break, and then said one calm sentence that settled something in Walter's chest. "Let them walk into that room expecting a confused old man, Walter. We'll be ready with the truth instead." The next morning, Walter dressed carefully, the way he used to dress for the biggest deals of his career, and rode to what Celeste believed was a routine doctor's visit, with her hand resting gently on his arm the entire way, her face already arranged into soft, practiced concern. What she didn't know was that this wasn't a private appointment at all. It was a preliminary competency hearing, moved up quietly at Julian's own request, held in a small conference room with a court-appointed evaluator, a judge's clerk, and Walter's own attorney, seated at the far end of the table, a folder thick with evidence resting in front of him, like a closed hand waiting to be played. Celeste performed beautifully, just as she always did. She dabbed at her eyes at exactly the right moment, described Walter's confusion and unsteady spells with just the right trembling catch in her voice, painted herself as a devoted wife, forced into the hardest decision of her life, out of nothing but love. The evaluator nodded along sympathetically. Julian sat beside her, calm and professional, occasionally adding a soft, supportive detail of his own, and Walter simply sat and watched her, silent, letting her finish every carefully rehearsed word of it, because he wanted the room to hear the whole performance before his attorney opened that folder. When Celeste finally finished, dabbing one last practiced tear from her cheek, Walter's attorney cleared his throat and slid 3 things across that table, one at a time. First, the pharmacy records, showing the exact dates Walter's medication had been diluted, matched precisely against the dates of his documented confused spells. Second, the private investigator's photographs and notes, tracking Celeste and Julian's 2 visits to the county courthouse, weeks before any doctor had ever suggested a guardianship was necessary. And third, the piece that made Celeste's carefully composed face finally truly crack, a recorded phone call between Julian and a business associate, discussing the timeline for taking control of Walter's shipping empire once guardianship was secured, and how quickly certain assets could be restructured afterward. The room went dead silent. Celeste's tears, for the very first time in 18 months of marriage, stopped being a performance and became something real. Panic, sharp and unguarded, flashing across her face before she could compose it back into grief. Julian tried to speak, tried to explain the recording away as business speculation, but the evaluator was already closing her folder, already recommending the guardianship petition be dismissed entirely, already suggesting the district attorney's office take a very close look at everything laid out on that table. Julian's law license would be suspended within the month, pending a full investigation, and Celeste, under the ironclad prenuptial agreement Walter's own attorney had insisted on years before this marriage ever began, walked away from that marriage with exactly nothing. No house, no settlement, no second chance to rehearse another ending. Walter went home that evening, a free man in every sense of the word, and the first thing he did was find Carla in the kitchen, finishing up the last of her afternoon work, Mia sitting quietly at the counter with her crayons like always. Walter knelt down slowly in front of the little girl, the same way he had that first evening she'd asked her strange, world-changing question, and said, "Mia, sweetheart, I need to thank you for something very important." Mia looked up at him with those same calm, watchful eyes, waiting patiently to understand what she'd done. Walter smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile that House had seen in a long while, and asked her gently how she always seemed to notice the truth before the grown-ups around her ever did. Mia shrugged, simple as anything, and said, "I just watch people's eyes, Mr. Walter. Yours are always honest, hers weren't." Walter set up a full college fund for Mia that same week, gave Carla a secure, permanent place in his household and his life, and never again mistook a rehearsed tear for a real one. So let me ask you, friend, has a child ever told you something so simple, so plain, that it turned out to be the exact truth you couldn't quite see yourself? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if this story reminded you that the smallest, quietest voices in a room often see the clearest, do an old storyteller a kindness and press that subscribe button before you go. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to me. Good night, friend, and always listen closely to the ones too honest to know how to lie.